Okay, so let's just first do a round of introductions. As I say, my name is Anca, and I will be your host today, and I'm joined by Christine, who will be looking at monitoring the chat and the Q&A during the webinar, and then we'll answer any questions that you have at the end of the webinar. So the structure today is a 40 to 45 minute presentation, including a short quiz, followed by 10 minutes or so to answer any questions. The slides of the webinar will be placed online on our website so that you can use the information and links it contains. And as I said, a recording will also be available on our on the UKDS YouTube channel. If you have a problem during the webinar, you can raise your hand or you can submit a question in the chat and Christine should be able to assist you. And again, for more complex questions, of course, related to the content of the webinar, we will be answering these at the end. Hopefully we'll have time for as many as possible. Okay, and because we're recording this webinar, all participants are muted, so please do not unmute yourself. Please use the chat and the Q&A if you want to make any comments or have any questions, okay? So let us begin. Just to give you a brief summary of this session, we'll start with a short overview of who we are at the UK Data Service and what we do. Then we'll have a short and fun, may I say, quiz. We will then come back to the presentation and look at what documentation we need to prepare when planning to share our data, including some examples. We will also cover data management plans and data security strategies, and then we will answer your questions. Okay, so just to quickly mention that all the information presented in this webinar are just highlights, so you can find more detailed and more complete information on our website, and we have various other training materials available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and the links will be provided at the end of this webinar as well. Okay, so the UK Data Service is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and is a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. We provide support and training for data creators with accessing, managing, sharing, and using data. This is delivered by staff based at universities across the UK, including Essex, Manchester, Leeds, Southampton, Edinburgh, and UCL. The UK Data Archive here at the University of Essex manages the UK Data Service, and we also archive the data. I included here a link to the website and our data catalog, so that is where you can search for keywords of data that you're interested in accessing. And I also included a link to all our events page where you can find more webinars and more events that we're running. RI funded projects, only projects that collect new data, or ESRC funded projects, ESRC being the Economic and Social Research Council. Okay, the time is up, and the most common answer was all projects, and that is very good. Regardless of the funder, having a data management plan is very useful, and we will see, I shall not give away the reasons why, although I'm sure most of you already know the benefits, but yes, it is a very good step to have a data management plan for all projects, all research projects. Okay, let's move on to the second question. Okay, when is data sharing not possible? Consent for it did not cover data sharing, data is sensitive, risk of identification is present, the participant has opted out, or all of the above. Let's see. Right, so most common answer was all of the above. I can see participant opted out. That was actually the answer that we selected as correct here. And the reason why is because the first option, so the consent form did not cover data sharing. That is something that should not be the case. So consent forms should address both participation in the research project and data sharing at the end of the project. So if the consent form did not cover data sharing, that doesn't necessarily preclude it, because we can do retrospective, for example, if that is possible. In some cases it's possible, in some cases it's not. So there is some leeway there as well. If the data is sensitive, that is also not a reason to preclude data sharing, because for that we have we have access regulation, we have the option of pseudonymizing, so reducing some of the detail, and as I said before, restricting access to that, so it's only available for research purposes, for example, or even more strict sort of access conditions. The risk of identification is present, so this is really very, if we were to stop data sharing just because there's a small risk of identification, then the data that is out there available would be very, very little, right? So the only really a reason why the data could not be shared, and of course there are a couple more reasons, but in this case, if the participant has opted out, then really there is nothing you can do. They said no, they don't want their data shared, so that is the end of the story. Okay, right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, when should we put together a data management plan? Is it before data collection, before data sharing, at the end of the project, throughout the project, or at the beginning of the project? Right, at the beginning of the project. And yes, so here I should probably explain that because of the version of Mentimeter we have, it's not possible to have multiple answers, multiple correct answers. But here at the beginning of the project, then throughout the project would be the correct answers. However, I selected throughout the project because, as you know, the data management plan should be a living document, and should be put together at the beginning of the project. However, it should also be maintained throughout the project. So that is why here, if you selected both at the beginning of the project and throughout the project, very well done. Before data collection, that would not be a very good idea, because we need to identify certain key aspects of data management in the very beginning of the project, and not leave it until we think about, before data collection. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. What can we prevent by having a data management plan? Data loss, breach participant confidentiality, inability to share data, all of the above. Right. That is very well. It's all of the above. We can prevent several things from happening if we have a data management plan, and if we think about these aspects early on in the project. Okay. Next question. The data management plan should be a living document. And I probably already gave away this answer. Is it true, false, or is it not sure? Right. Yes, that is true. The data management plan should be a document that is created at the beginning of the project and maintained throughout the project, the research project. Okay. Next question. Who is responsible for data management in a research team? Is it the principal investigator, so the PI, the data support officer? Is it the university or institution that the researchers are affiliated to, or is this to be delegated for each project? Yes, so the correct answer here would be that it needs to be delegated for each project at the beginning, ideally. So there should be someone responsible for data management and data sharing in that team. If there isn't anyone, and I see how that is the second answer, most popular answer here, if there isn't such a person who was delegated, then it is the responsibility of the principal investigator. Yes. Moving on to the next question. Password protection is sufficient. True, false, it can be, or not sure. Okay, so the two most common answers are false and it can be. The correct answer here would be false because, and I'll explain why. The reasoning here is that when we're trying to protect data, it's not just the data that we collect, right? It's also our data. So my personal laptop, for example, I wouldn't want anyone to have access to it, someone that, of course, I would like to control who has access to it. And just having a simple password is not enough. If I were to leave my laptop on a train, that wouldn't preclude someone from accessing it, because if you remove the hard drive, then you can easily access the files. So that is why password protection is not sufficient. It's not sufficient. It can be, again, if you in the example I gave earlier, if you don't necessarily mind having someone access, or that you think, oh, what's the likelihood of me forgetting my my laptop in a train, then yeah, but it's really advisable that you use encryption, and that's just the next step from just using a password. Okay, right, let's move on to the next question. What is the main benefit of having a data management plan? Is it complying with funder requirements, helps stay organized, helps anticipate cost, helps prepare against risks, or all of the above? Right, and yes, all of the above. That is the correct answer, and that is also the most popular answer. Very good. Okay, let's move on. I think we only have 2 more questions left. Okay, what will we add under costing in a data management plan? Digitization, transcription, translation, or all of the above? So do we need to account for costs that we might need to take into account when we come to digitize the data, transcribing the data, translating the data, if that applies, or all of the above? And yes, that is the most common and correct answer. It's all of the above. Okay, so let's have a little bit of background. So data sharing is becoming more and more important across multiple disciplines because it provides benefits not just to ourselves as researchers, but also to our institutions, our funders, and the general public more widely. Okay, it is essential here that we have good research data management habits, because if we do this earlier on in the project, it can lead to potential, it can prevent potential problems later on. For example, if adequate consent is not obtained to share the data collected, or consider the complexities of data anonymization early on, it might lead to more work down the line. Or of course, if the consent is not appropriate, that might prevent us from sharing the data, especially if retrospective consent is not an option. The core message here is to think about data management throughout the whole life cycle of the research project, and write down a data management plan to enable you to keep track of your actions and your team's actions. Nowadays, many funders and publishers have specific requirements for data handling and require a data management plan, or DMP, included in the initial grant application to ensure that researchers have considered these aspects early on. So why is it so important that we manage research data well? Where to begin with, data creation in research is often expensive, and this is not just in terms of money, but also time invested in creating and documenting novel data. And of course that data itself is the cornerstone of research, and the hope is that good quality data will lead to very good quality research. Furthermore, this data underpins all our published research findings, so by ensuring that we manage our data well, it enables us to comply with ethical codes, data protection laws, journal requirements, as well as our funders' policies. It's also important here to protect what might be personal as well as other types of data from loss, destruction, and of course potential exposure. Some very simple practical steps that researchers can take would be, firstly, of course, as we looked at, writing a data management plan at the very beginning of the research project. This is now a requirement for most funders, as we already saw, to ensure aspects such as storage, processing, access, destruction, etc. are thought through in advance. It is very likely that there will be local support at your university or institution that can help in this regard. We have extensive guidance on our website on how to write a data management plan, and a link to the template that we recommend using will be provided at the end of this webinar as well. Okay. Also very important is that the data can be shared with others and understood at the point of using the data. So it's therefore essential that consent for sharing is obtained from participants. So depending on what participants agree, we might not be allowed to disclose their identities, and here anonymization and access control are essential. Sorry. Which we will have look at in other webinars as well. There are other webinars on this as a separate and on legal that cover legal and ethical, and you can join that. Unfortunately, that is beyond the purpose of this and the time of this webinar. Okay, so we will also need to think in advance about the type of software and formats that we choose to use. So using formats which are closed or proprietary mean that others may not have access, or standards may change and develop over time. They might not be compatible with new versions. So it's also essential that we provide context or metadata and documentation with our data so that others can understand the data that we share. And finally, of course, it's important to ensure that we protect the data throughout the project lifecycle by means of secure storage and encryption. Next, I wanted to have a look at the different sections that a data management plan should ideally touch upon. So these include an assessment of any relevant existing data that might be of use, so that collection of new data might not be necessary or can perhaps be restricted, or establishing that there is no similar data available, in which case you have to collect new data to base your findings on, of course. So the DMP should also describe in detail how you're planning on going about collecting this new data and from who, etc. So this is linked to procedures you will set in place to ensure that the new data collected meets certain quality standards, how this data will be stored, so securely, of course, and where will it be backed up to avoid data loss. We'll have a look at this later on as well. Another section should address any difficulties foreseen in sharing this data for replication or for reuse, be it in an archive or in an institutional repository. For example, if secondary data is used, that will mean copyright might prevent you from disseminating that data at the end of the project, or it might be that the appropriate permissions need to be set in place to allow you to archive that data. Another very important section is around issues of consent, anonymization, and potential reuse strategies, followed by a section on so issues of copyright and intellectual property ownership. Think about who will own copyright over the data that you collect. Would it be yourself? Would it be your institution? Will your participants maintain copyright over their data, or will there be shared copyright? So it might be the case that you need to address this in your consent form or your information sheet. Another aspect to consider is who in the research team will be responsible for which aspects of so collection, storage, backing up, encryption, cleaning, anonymization, and archiving the data. So as we saw in the quiz, there should be someone delegated for this task. Finally, there is a section on data management, on management and curation, so you can find more information using the links provided in this slide here. And please make sure to read this carefully, because it will provide you with more substantive information that I provided here. Okay. So at the UK Data Archive, there are a variety of ways in which we protect participants' identities while ensuring that you comply with your legal and ethical obligations. So we refer to this as a three-step approach. To begin with, it is important to establish what legal gateway, also referred as the processing ground, applies to that particular data collection and processing. If the legal gateway you're using is consent, then it's important to ensure that you seek informed, granular consent to share and preserve the data in the long term. So again, when we looked in the quiz at the difference between participation and sharing, it's important that you address data sharing separately in the consent form. Again, more on this in another webinar. It's called legal and ethical. I think it's tomorrow, so you can still have time to register for this. So following from this is ensuring that you protect your participants' identities at all times, so in line with what they agree in their consent forms. This can be done by anonymizing or pseudonymizing the data, of course. It might be that you do not need to collect someone's personal information, for example, as this is normally just used for administrative purposes. So the point here is to only collect data, and especially personal data here, that you need for your particular project. The third aspect to consider is access regulation, which is normally needed for data that even after anonymization or pseudonymization will still contain residual disclosure risk, or data that cannot be anonymized sufficiently without reducing its reuse potential. There will be there will be some more information at the end of this slide with more links for you to read on this. Okay, moving on, let's look at how to best document our data to make sure it is reusable. So the most important thing about documentation is simply that it should allow others with no prior knowledge of the data to understand it and possibly reuse it in their projects. So what information would they need to make sense of it? Here at UKDA, we archive this information as well as supporting documentation in our collections. It also allows us to ensure accurate processing and data disclosure review before we publish the data. Okay. So what exactly should be included as documentation when we're archiving the data? So examples here include a methodology file, so explaining how the data was collected, a sample size fieldwork protocols code book, a user guide, blank versions of the consent form and information sheets that were used, the questionnaire used, a data list, and we will have a closer look at this in a moment. What is a data list? And any link to any reports or publications that resulted from that data. Okay, so looking at that data level documentation, so all structured tabular data should have adequate variable names as well as variable labels and value labels. So in terms of variable names, here are a few suggestions. Very important here is to ensure that they match question numbers in the questionnaire that you used. It's important to use meaningful abbreviations as well. So, and for interoperability across platforms, variable names should not exceed 8 characters. Okay. Looking at variable labels, so some of the same applies. Make sure they reference the question text and what it includes, and that it includes units of measurements where applicable, value labels as well, ensure that these are described as well and that missing values are declared and differences between these missing values are recorded separately. So if it's missing as opposed to a skipped question, etc. Okay. Next, I wanted to include information about what a user guide, so I mentioned a user guide before, under what documentation should be uploaded with your data. So a user guide can include any project-specific information that would be needed to understand the data, such as the interview schedule, methodology, study findings, consent procedures, transcription notes, code book, etc. If you'd like to see an example, you can see this collection here available from our catalog. Again, so the links will be included in the presentation and the presentation will be available for you. Okay. Okay, so we spoke already about data list that can be archived along with qualitative data. So this is specifically for if you're planning on collecting qualitative data. So here is an example of how this would look like. And sorry, I need to. Sorry. Of how, so this is an example of how it would look like and what information it should contain. So again, this is project specific, and you might be collecting different information in your research. We refer to this as a map to the collection, as it provides an at a glance summary of all the files that were archived. This is very useful for new users as well as for yourself. If you were to come back to your project, say in a few years' time perhaps, and you need to remember, have an exact view of the transcripts that you had or the files that you had years ago and you don't remember them. Or perhaps someone else is interested in a subsample of your data. So in this case, for example, perhaps someone is only interested in farms that are larger than 300 hectares. So in this case, they can come here and they can see, okay, which are the ones that that satisfy that condition, and then we have the file name. Right, so they know exactly where to go and find that. They don't have to open every single file and see the farm size. Okay, so it's just an easier way to have a record of the files in the collection. Okay. Right, so when we think about transcription templates, these should possess a unique identifier and adopt a uniform layout throughout the research project. Speaker tags should be used to identify who is speaking when, include line breaks, and be page numbered. And every file should have a document header giving brief details of the interview and the interviewee or focus group participant, etc. Okay. As an example, here you can see how a transcript can look like and the information it should contain. So it is clear who is speaking when. So we have respondent, interviewee, or interviewer, sorry. And it is clear who they are. There are line breaks in between, and there is useful information at the top about who is being interviewed, right? So the different demographic information, age, gender, occupation, etc. And you can have a closer look at this example using the link provided at the bottom of the slide here. Okay. Another very important aspect to consider are file formats. So making sure that we consider what are the most appropriate software to use for the research you are undertaking. As I'm sure you are aware, digital data is very much software dependent. And so it can be endangered by, and I'm sorry, I cannot say the word, I always say it wrong, obsolescence. That would be the one. So by time, right? So we need to have this in mind. So it's worth pointing out that for long-term preservation, the best formats to use are standard, interchangeable, and open software. Okay, and for information on what exactly that means for the data you're collecting, I included our guidance here. So depending on where you're planning to share your data, they might have different guidance on this, although of course this should hopefully be pretty much the same for the sake of reusing the data, of course. But for us, for the UK Data Service, you can check our recommended and acceptable file formats there. And I also included a link to the Digital Preservation Coalition and their guidance as well on preservation formats. Okay, so other practical considerations during your project include making sure we organize the data and documentation logically and in a manner that is easy to understand. Make sure to group files by date, data type, or location. So if the project covers more than one location, for example, and that they follow a hierarchical structure. Also make sure to use version control for files if needed, so that it's easy to identify what the final version of the document is. This will make it much more easier when you reach the end of the project and you're thinking about data sharing. If you have everything organized, it will just be easier for you to find everything. Okay, we will now have a brief look at data security and storage issues. So it's very important when we collect data to think in advance about mechanisms and procedures that need to be put in place to prevent unauthorized access, use, change, disclosure, or destruction of our data. Right, so we need to think about who else will have access to it, who else can have access to it, right. So what are the possible solutions? And how do we go about adopting a data security strategy? So some of this information is perhaps very basic, but it is essential to avoid the issues we spoke about on the previous slide. So controlling access to computers by using secure passwords and encryption ideally, as we saw before, locking our computers when away, ensuring that our antivirus protection is up to date, ensuring that we protect so that by ensuring that our antivirus protection is up to date, that we protect our computers from power surges that might render them useless as well. That's another thing to think about. Right, restricting access, particularly to sensitive and personal information, is essential. Always make sure to keep these separate from anonymized data. So make sure that you separate personal from anonymized data as early as possible in the project. Ensure that you utilize encryption so as we spoke before, across all devices and at all locations. So this is a safer, more secure option than using passwords, as we saw. Right. Finally, ensure that you properly dispose of unwanted copies of the data and equipment at the end of the project. What is vital to remember here is that personal data needs more protection than anonymized data. So while some solutions might be appropriate for some types of data, they might not be appropriate for personal information. Okay. Because we touched on encryption, this slide provides you with some options. Just to mention that we don't, we don't recommend one in particular. You might opt for one over another depending on your operating system or what exactly you need encrypting, whether you wish to encrypt an entire hard drive or just a particular file or folder or a USB stick. So at the bottom of this slide, you can find the link to our UKDS playlist, which contains several tutorials on encryption, on different encryption software that you can use. Okay, and here are some more links to YouTube tutorials that we produce, and we thought that that would be useful. So these are different encryption software, and yeah, I'll let you have a look at that in your own time. Another aspect to consider is having a digital backup strategy to avoid data loss or data destruction. And there are multiple things to consider here. So what do we need to back up, where, what type of media we can use, how often we need to duplicate or synchronize the information backed up, how long do we need to keep it, and here there might be different data retention policies that apply, of course, as advised, for example, by your ethics committee. Also, it's very important that you check these backups regularly to ensure that they're still in working condition. And you might wonder why this is so important. There have been multiple cases of recorded some over social media as well, where the only copy of the data has been destroyed, for example, during a house fire, or it was stolen, or it was, again, forgotten in a train. So having the data backed up in a secure location prevents us from losing time-consuming work or results, or having to collect new data. Okay. Looking at file sharing, so we often need to share our files with our research partners, and doing this over email is not considered best practice. And there are other options, as I'm sure you're aware. So there are virtual research environments available, or locally managed, such as OwnCloud or Zen2, which we use actually here at the University of Essex, or physical media can be sent encrypted through the post. There are cloud locations such as Google Drive or Dropbox. However, we have to be cautious about security concerns there. There are some options that claim to be more secure than others. What we recommend here is just to assess the risk of using cloud storage, whether these are appropriate for your data. And a very good idea would be, again, to ask your university or institution for advice on this. Here at the archive, we don't necessarily advise storing personal data, especially personal data or commercially sensitive data in the cloud. For more information on this, you can check our guidance online. Okay. Moving on to one of our final slides, so looking at data disposal, this is very important to consider at the end of the research project. If we have personal information or copies on hard drives, if we simply delete that data, that file, that is typically not sufficient. So deletion only unflags the files. If we write over that data by reformatting, that is also not sufficient. So if it is incredibly sensitive data, personal data, the only way to ensure its complete destruction of that data is to physically destroy the hard drive. And there are specialist services that can do this. Again, check with your institution or university, and they should have guidance on this. Okay, and as I said in the beginning, so this presentation was just a summary of the main aspects that need considering during a research project from a data management point of view. And we have extensive information available on our website. I also included here a link to the SES, the Data Management Expert Guide. This is a very comprehensive resource as well for data management. And also we published the book, Managing and Sharing Research Data, if you're interested in purchasing that. And again, a link to our training events. You can also follow us on Twitter. And here I included, as I mentioned during the presentation, some links to our tools and templates. So we have here our model consent form, transcription template, the data list template that I mentioned, and there's a bit more. This is just a few. We have more on our website under tools and templates. Okay, in terms of training again, so we have a data management basics series. So this is part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow, and that is covering ethical and legal aspects of data sharing. And there are a couple more webinars that I listed here. If you go on our webpage under events, you should be able to scroll through the available ones and register for them. Okay, and of course, please keep connected. You can subscribe to our UKDS service mailing list, just mail as well. You can follow us on Twitter, and also that is a link to our YouTube channel. Okay, and any questions, please get in touch. You can use our help desk. My name is again Anca, Vlad. You can mention that YouTube part in the webinar, and you had additional questions, and they should forward the question to me if we don't have time to address it now in the question section. Okay, and that now I'll stop sharing the screen. And we can move on to your questions. Okay, so again, if you have any more questions, please submit them under Q&A or in the chat, and we'll have a look at them now. Okay, so we had a question about sharing qualitative interview data, and the question exactly was, if we share our qualitative data, can someone just use that and steal our work? So this is a long answer. I feel that I wouldn't have time to go through all the aspects there, but so in terms of data sharing, this is becoming really more and more the norm, not just from a reuse perspective, but also from a replication point of view. And sharing your data does not necessarily mean that someone were to steal your work. First of all, there are a few options there. You can place your data under embargo, so that would not give anyone access for a specific period of time. And also another project would surely have other interests in that data. They might not necessarily use it for the primary purpose that it was collected for, of course, because it was designed for that project, and it wouldn't necessarily answer their same research questions. But they might use that data for background information, for example, if they're working on the same more or less wide topic as you are. It might just help them with, so of course other people would interpret the data perhaps in a slightly different way. So in terms of stealing your work, in my experience and in our experience at the UK Data Archive, that has never been the case in our a few decades in operation and making data available. We also have a webinar on data reuse, qualitative data reuse, that you might be interested in. Have a look at our events page. I believe that it's coming up now in June, and it's a very, very good webinar by my colleague Maureen Haker, who is a specialist in using qualitative data. And yeah, that was that question. Let's see what else we have. Someone asked if our YouTube videos are available to the general public. Yes, they are. Someone else asked about, they said that they feel uncomfortable with asking a participant if they could share the data. We understand this is something that is coming up quite a lot in our discussion with researchers, but that should still not be an issue, because they can always say no, and you can make it very clear for them that, for example, you can mention that it is a requirement from your funder to consider this, and then of course you can explain to them that they have an option about this. If they say that they don't want to participate, then that is the end of the story. The data will not be shared beyond your project. So it depends there who you're being funded by, for example, because some funders do require to have this addressed. So data sharing is expected at the end of the project. So I don't know there who you're being funded by, and so whether you can use that. Mention that to your participants as well, that it's a funder requirement that you need to ask for consent for that. But yeah. There was another question about, sorry, can anyone use the Reshare site? Yes, Reshare is a self-deposit repository. When you say anyone, so it would depend really, because we focus on, our remit is social science data. So so if you fit in that spectrum, then that should be fine. There's actually a webinar on Reshare next week that I'm doing as well. So if you're planning on using Reshare, you can join that as well, if you think it would be useful. Someone else can you recommend repositories for sharing sensitive data, or where one can find those in particular, in general? So you can use Reshare, so you can use the UK Data Service, UK Data Archive. We certainly have quite a lot of collections that would be classified as sensitive data, and you can also check if there is if your university has its own repository. So more and more now is the case that universities would have their own repository, and you can contact them about sharing your data with them. There's another website that you can use. It's called re3data.org. and you can have a look at that as well. It lists quite a few, I think it has over 2,000 repository listed. When you say, right, so there's another question about reshare. Can this be used outside the UK? Yes, we do. We have received the data from outside the UK. But again, so get in touch with us. If you send us an email and explain the particular, you know, the specifics of your project, then we can decide whether reshare is the best place to share that data, or we can recommend another repository or archive. Okay, someone asked about if my if my funder does not have specific data sharing requirements, should one rely on the university's policy, or is it up to the, oh, sorry, I lost the question. Or is it up to the personal researcher, the principal researcher, especially when it comes to cross-cultural contexts? So now, I should probably mention that data sharing is just good practice. It's not just replication, is reuse. So if we think about, especially for qualitative data, not especially, but let's take qualitative data as an example. If we're interviewing people that would, for example, be very difficult to reach, right, in 10, 20 years from now. For example, we had a collection about the migration wave that happened in, was it 2018? Sorry, my memory is very bad. But we had a project about that a couple of years ago, and it was a very, very comprehensive collection. And you know, it would be very difficult to reach the same people again, or to reach, you know, in the same context and the same timeline, etc. So it's very, if you can share data, it can be very valuable for historians in the future, for your peers in the same field that might be interested in having a look at that data. So it's not just so this requirement for funders really comes to meet that need in the research community, I feel, of just sharing our data if we can, of course. So if we meet all the ethical and the legal requirements to share our data, why not do it if we can benefit our field and our research community at large? So I hope that answered your question more or less. So even if it's not a requirement by your funder, if you can, then the advice and the best practice out there is that you could and you should share your data. Okay. I'm looking at the time and we only have 1 minute left, and it's very difficult. I try to pick the question, well, more or less all the questions, but okay. So there was another question about if some of the participants do not consent to data sharing, does this mean they cannot be part of the sample, or funding would be withdrawn? So of course not. So if participants do not consent to data sharing, that does not preclude them from being involved in the project or from you using, so it would just be if they consent to participation, of course, and that should also be, of course, addressed in the consent form. If they consent to participation, then, and that is not, you know, you would not need to remove their data from your data set. It just means that you would not share the data, their data, and that is fine. Funding is not conditional on that, of course, so your funding will still be there, even if, of course, consent for sharing was not granted. So no, the only thing that consent for data sharing would preclude is data sharing. It doesn't have any other implications. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. We are right. It's 12 o'clock. The slides will be shared, and as I said, there was a link to our help desk on the last slide. If you have any other questions, please, sorry, and if your question wasn't answered, I'm sorry, we are out of time. Please contact us using the help desk, and if you mention that this is in relation to the data management webinar, if you can also mention my name, I don't mind, and they will send that to me, and I'll be able to get back to you with an answer. And we can even have a call if you have a more complex project and you have more complex questions. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for joining. I hope it was this was useful and it answered some of your questions. And yeah, please be in touch if you have any other questions. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.